right, cool. So, I was not really sure how to do a session on just speaking in general, because it's just a very general sort of vague topic. So, I thought I'd break it up into sort of a few some like. So, the first thing I'm going to talk about here is how exactly uh there's a lot of good workshops out there on how to get better as a speaker, self-improvement, and all that. I'm also not going to be focusing on training in general. Like, I'm not going to be talking about any specific skills or drills or anything. I'm just going to be talking about what to do in rounds, like what the purpose of your speeches are, what you're trying to do to convince the judge. And so I've broken it up into a few parts. So the first thing I've broken it up into is prep time and strategy. These are just general heuristics as to what you want to be doing during prep time. Then I have some general tips on top half and then back half. And then after that, I have some tips on out rounds. So the purpose of the workshop is not really to give you like some kind of comprehensive overview on how to do every single thing in speaking ever, but it's just when you go into a round, what should you be sort of trying to aim for? And what has worked for me and most of my friends and people that I've learned from. Um, the normal caveat obviously is that, not everything works for everyone. People have different styles and so on. So if this is helpful for you, use it. If it's not, then you don't have to. So I'm going to start by talking about prep time. So I want to make this a bit interactive. So does anyone have any ideas on how you organize your prep time? And specifically, what the aim of your prep time is when you're doing top half and back half prep? Because I think they're very, very different. So if anyone has any suggestions, that would really help me sort of make this work. So any of you have any suggestions on how you do your prep time? Sure, Daniel, go for it.
I think it's we don't do things all that differently, top half, lower half. But what I try to do with my partners is essentially trying to find the core of the debate, what we feel is going to be the center of the debate, where people are going to clash. What are the most intuitive arguments and not so intuitive? Perhaps that'll be a difference between upper and lower. Upper, we're trying to find what's most obvious and the most obvious clashes. Lower, we're trying to find perhaps more nuanced and specific clashes issues. But I feel like overall what we're trying to do is just find the clashes, find the center of the debate.
Okay, that's a good. I think that's a good approach though. Like trying to find the actual core of the debate as opposed to what's distracting us, which is like random mechanisms or random way, but like actually trying to find what we're genuinely questioning in the sport. So that's fine. Does anyone else have any suggestions on what you do in your prep time? You can also just unmute, by the way. You don't have to like worry about that.
Hello. Yeah, so I think
Yeah.
after both of us largely agree on what we should be aiming at, we should try to flesh out the way we prove it by just bouncing ideas off each other to make sure they're actually well proven enough. So it's not just assertive.
Got it. Yeah, I think that's reasonable as well. So this is like a generally accepted approach, which is you look at the motion, you try to understand what you want to run, and you try to understand how to run it, and then you run it. So this is like a very common way to approach prep time. So I'm gonna give a suggestion that particularly helped me sort of standardize my prep times. Now, the first thing I'm going to talk about is what I think the goals should be, and then I'll give you a suggestion of structure. The first one I think will be a lot more helpful because you can come up with your own structure, whichever one works for you is fine. So in terms of goals, the first thing you want to do during prep time is before anything else, you want to understand extremely clearly what the trade-off in the debate is. So what that means is that often when you get a motion, it's going to make you rush. So especially for a lot of the people who will be doing competitions like this one, right? Like this is like a national competition. So you guys have been preparing for it. You've been doing tourneys. So you know a bunch of stock arguments when you see a motion. So an example of this is that the AVP motion recently was this house regrets the emphasis on sacrifice in determining the moral values of actions. It's a bit of a complex motion, but the second you see it, people start rushing to say, why is sacrifice good? Why is sacrifice bad? So for a motion like that, the first thing I'm suggesting in terms of your aims when you're doing prep is that you should remember that you want to understand exactly what the actual trade-off in the motion is, not just what it looks like the stock clashes. So what you want to do is, and this sounds a bit like I'm talking to schoolies, but it is genuinely something that helped me at least. You want to read through it, underline the keywords. And I know someone who, like Kevin Hamel, close friend of mine, like top-breaking European speaker, underlines every single word, not just like the keywords, but like literally underlines words like the. But you don't have to do something that extreme. And figure out what is the exact specific margin in the debate. So my first suggestion is not to spend time when you see the motion immediately jumping into arguments, because normally that's what people do in silent time. And that's fine, but I think it's more important to understand what the exact margin is. So for the example I gave you, a lot of people might be thinking, oh, this motion is about sacrifice. Another person might be thinking it's about the emphasis on sacrifice, the narrative motion. But if you listen to the motion carefully, when I was saying it, it says the emphasis on sacrifice in determining the moral value of actions. So if you thought like just a minute more, you'd realize it's about specific instances where actions have to be assessed as moral or not moral. And that is very different to a narrative about sacrifice. It's very different to just sacrifice as a whole. So the first thing to do is when you're finding the trade-off, you want to know every single aspect of the world that the motion is assessing, and you want to find the exact margin of what that motion is talking about. The second aim in terms of what you're doing as sort of when you're going into prep is, I agree with Daniel in the sense that you're looking for the core of the debate. So when you're looking for arguments, your goal in top half and back half will differ, but you're looking for the most strategically relevant argument. And what that should normally mean is the argument that is at the core of other arguments. So in top half, my suggestion is that you're looking for what the underlying question behind a huge amount of the clashes is. So now for this, I'll use a different example. So there's a motion which is collective salvation, a world with collective salvation is better than a world with. We all think that we'll go to hell or heaven based on what the people in our religious group do. And individual salvation is just what you do. Now, this is a debate where people will go in all sorts of different directions, and they'll say, okay, so the trade-off is that in collective salvation, I'll force people to do things that I think are good because otherwise I'll go to hell. Or I might even help other people and I might be pressured to help other people. So if I'm rich, someone might pressure me to donate to charity because they think that if I don't donate to charity, then I'll be a bad person and then we'll all go to hell. So, you could have that as collective salvation. Individual salvation, you can have like 500 different arguments like, oh, you have a personal relationship with God, it becomes easier. But the core of the debate is not actually just the trade-off between intervention and interfering. If you think carefully about it in top half, what you'll notice is that if there is a group of people and all of them are moral in the sense that they're good people and the things they want to do are good, then them being collective, acting in a way that is focused on making sure the other person acts morally or helping other people, that means that it's a generally good society. But if they all believe in bad systems, for example, they believe that like, I don't know, everyone named Bob should be murdered, then it's probably better for us to have individual salvation because their belief system is wrong. And you'll realize that the core of the debate of collective and individual salvation, something that determines a big part of what comes in forward into the round, is what exactly do these people believe? Do they believe in things that we believe are good, or do they believe in things that we believe are bad? And you've suddenly gone one step beyond what you're supposed to be doing as a speaker. So you've already gotten the trade-off in a way that other people haven't. It's more nuanced. And you've understood what the actual question in the debate is. The third aim in your prep should be to cut down on how much time you need to speak. So this is where I'll get into the structure later, but you want to be doing things efficiently. So you want your prep to have the exact wording of how you're going to make an argument. You want your prep to have the exact burdens of what you need to prove written in the prep. So the main aim is execution. That's the third aim, which is you want to go into your speech knowing exactly how you'll use every single second. You don't want anything to be like done on the spot. You want it to be prepared. This doesn't mean you need to like write your speech down like word for word, but it means you need to know exactly how you're going to be using each 10 seconds, each 5 seconds, how much time you're willing to waste on POI, stuff like that. So these should be the three aims of prep. The first aim should be understanding very, very clearly what the motion is asking of you. The second should be identifying your into and how. Third thing should be how will you execute all of this in your speech in the first place? So my suggestion for structure now, this one is a bit more practical, and this one is also something that you can choose to agree on or disagree on. So obviously the first thing you do in your prep when you're trying to find the trade-off is what we call framing. So I actually didn't understand what framing meant. In fact, funnily enough, just a month ago is when I finally learned the meaning of the word framing. Might be like an ESL thing, but I just never used the word framing. But now I understood what it means. But anyway, it basically just means that you're trying to zero in the debate on the margin. You're not trying to focus on all sorts of other useless stuff. So the first thing I always do in prep is I sit down and I look at the motion, and I will sometimes take up to 5 minutes, but preferably, you guys are better than me and smarter, so you'll do it faster. I'll just sit there looking at the motion, and I'll try to visualize an example of what the trade-off looks like. And I'll try to make sure that the example fits every criteria of the motion. So, for example, for collective or individual salvation, I could say that a collective salvation world is where there's people regularly meeting up, let's say at the church, at the mosque, at the temple or whatever, and then like regularly we ask people how life is going, but then we also regularly give them suggestions on what they should do in the future. While for individual salvation, I'm imagining a world where people sort of pray at home, and sometimes they might meet for festivals, but they're not like telling each other about their lives and getting advice on it. Maybe at best there's like a confessional where you talk to a priest, but there's no like aggressive sharing of things. And now I have an image of what the trade-off is. Like I have an image of people regularly meeting up and talking, and I have an image of people not doing that, sort of sitting at home. So pretty much for every motion, my suggestion for structure is that until you have a clear image of what the trade-off is, and your image is reasonable, not unfair, it's almost impossible for me, at least as a speaker, to debate anything if I don't know what the actual visual version of this is. And then after that, in terms of the second suggestion we were talking about, which is finding the core of the debate. So this is a suggestion I got from Hadar, a close friend of mine, and it's one that I think is similar to how I do sport. Is there's two methods I'm going to give you on finding the most important core argument, and this is going to be in top half. So now I'm going to start giving you suggestions on prep time in top half and prep time in back half. So let's start about top half. So in top half, what I will do is I will start the debate, I will look at the motion, I will see the trade-off, I will visualize what it looks like. And then I will write down the basic impacts. So in an econ motion, often the basic impacts are very obvious. So there could be an impact on investment. And that might mean that there's more businesses that are being, started up and so on. There could be an impact on things like cheaper goods. There could be an impact on things like jobs and so on. And a lot of them are very correlated. And what you'll notice is that in motions like economics or motions like social movements, we already have almost established as a circuit that we are trying to really address a separate core question. So in social movements, the core question is often, what is going to give you more buy-in? What is going to give you the capacity to push for your aims? For economics, the core question is, what is going to make people have more money and then produce more things? And then use that to give people who are poor the money that they need. Well, this is something that often we miss in other motion types, which are a bit more complex, or like motions that are designed designed to be a bit more nuanced. So the first method is to just list out arguments and just play them out in your head. So one of the things I remember is from Worlds, there was a motion which was um, whether a was it a post-conflict society? Yeah, I think it was a post-conflict society, whether it would be better if the opposition won an election against the majority party, and we had to say that it would be better if the opposition won, and the other side had to say it would be better if the majority party basically stayed in power forever. And the caveats were like, it's a fair election. So the first method there is just to throw out arguments. So an argument you could give about why the opposition party could win could be, it's good because it makes you hold the party to account, like the majority party. But the really simple response is already being held to account, but it's winning anyway. So we still have the media, we still have the opposition party, it doesn't go away. So this is like a symmetric argument. And you'll notice the rebuttal works on the assumption that this party won fairly. The second argument you could give is that the minority party will finally represent the views of the minority population. And that's good because now the minority population will get something as well. But the immediate response to that, almost always, is that in post-conflict states, it's not like the minority will be like 10% or something, right? A lot of times these countries are like 30, 40% each. And so to win a proper majority, you often do need to win for minorities. And the other thing, obviously, is that if you are a minority, then you could also be benefited by the majority party. So it's a bit unclear as to why you need the opposition party to win. And again, the assumption to that rebuttal is actually, hey, this party won by helping people, by fairly helping people. And what you'll notice when you go down the bench of all of these arguments is that any serious argument about why the opposition party should win falls if and only if the party that is winning, the majority party, does it fairly by helping people every time. So what you'll notice by going through lots of different arguments and how they're rebutted is that you'll notice the core assumption behind most of the case from opposition. Obviously, you're not doing this in the round itself because then it's too late. You're doing this in prep, you're sort of red teaming, right? Like one of you will be thinking of the op case, one of you will think of the cuff case or whatever. Or you'll be doing it in your head. So often throwing out lots of arguments can show you either lots and lots of ways in which one simple premise is beating your case, or it can show you the opposite, which is that all your arguments are going in the same direction. So the collective salvation argument that I gave earlier, even though I had lots of arguments about why maybe collective salvation will help you, like people will help each other because they'll talk to each other more, they'll ask them about their lives, they'll try to be helpful, or people will force rich people to donate to money, like to welfare, and like poor people will be helped. Or if someone is like harassing someone else, then they'll be held to account. All of these arguments I noticed had the same premise, which is that people and their religious beliefs are positive. So throwing out arguments, if you're fast enough and if you're comfortable with this strategy, helps you find out what the core premise of op is and what the core premise of your side is. For top half, this is actually really important because the issue with top half is you can't run everything. And the best thing you can do is to find the core analytical link, prove it to the point where it's almost impossible to extend on you, and then just expand impacts. Or at least that's what I've always found useful. The second method is the one that Hadar suggested. So this is also like a drill you can do, but I think it's helpful in round, which is you draw a flow chart. So you draw the motion, then you draw a line saying, what area does this affect? What area does this affect? What does this affect? Let's say we have 3 areas that it affects. And then you basically do the same process that I mentioned earlier, but like visually, which is that you see the arguments, you think about what is required to prove them, and you try to find the premise that will prove the most amount of arguments on your page. So that is my first suggestion for top half, which is that what you're trying to do is you're trying to find the core of the debate and you're trying to run it so that no one else can. And most of the time, if you've done it right, the core of the debate will give you access to so many impacts. So again, I'm of the strong belief that top half prep should always be focused on your leader speech because your deputy has time. But the point is that if your leader can prove this clear analytical link, then as a deputy, your life is so easy because you just need to expand it into all sorts of the impacts that it achieves. So if I prove that the religion is good in collective salvation, all I need to do is say that if people believe in good things, here's all the things they'll do when they believe in collective salvation. Here's the weighing on why they're more important than anything opposition can achieve. And it becomes a much simpler debate. And of course, that means that burning is easier because you're not burning people by just saying, you're not being Matt Cato, like, 5 reasons as to why it's stupid. Like, you're being like someone who's just saying, I've proven the core link, and now look at all of the things that happen because of it. So that can burn things in back half because not all of us are good enough to prove things quickly. Um, and second of all, it's also obviously useful because it means that it's very, very hard to break your case because you've identified exactly what your case actually is about. And then you have so much time to strengthen it, right? So ideally, when this goes well, the leader speech is just 7 minutes of protection. Like you're just bulking up the claims. And it's as of now, when this is done right, I've yet to see someone who can actually properly take that out. Like maybe the absolute top debaters can, but if you identify what the actual core of the debate is, then the point is that it's not really an argument, it's just true. So for example, if there's a motion about like funding women's like businesses, if I say that funding women's businesses is going to give women more jobs or give women more income, it's the core of the debate in a way where it's just like you can't really deny it. It's just a fact. Like it just maybe not a fact, but like it's just an extremely obvious intuitive claim. So you found something that you can depend on without having to risk being taken out. It's not a very weird connection. It's just like a direct thing that's just true. So that's the first suggestion for top half. The second suggestion for top half in terms of execution is you want to practice weighing in a way that is understandable to the judge, but is also strategically important. So, what I normally do in my deputy speeches when I'm preparing to beat back half is that to some extent, the problem with top half prep that a lot of people run into is that they try to preempt too much. So, in your deputy speech, you're like, I want to beat this case, I want to beat that case, I want to beat that case. And the other problem that they often run into is that they impact, but they don't weigh. So you might talk about how much of a big deal your case is, but you forget to explain how it strategically interacts with what's coming in front of you. And these two become a sort of catch-22, where if you don't address the teams, then your case becomes very hard to strategically place as a judge when you're deliberating. But if you do address the teams, then you end up being stuck in this quagmire of like preempting 5,000 different things. So my main suggestion, which is my second main suggestion for top half, especially for deputy speakers, is to identify once again the core logic behind other cases and their impacts. So, for example, in a motion about sanctions and whether we should use sanctions as a tool to force countries to do well or not, we proved two things. The first one was that sanctions make countries and the people in them poorer. So there's no way to do like targeted sanctions. Basically, poor people are also screwed. And that without sanctions, these countries would grow and they would have money. So our first impact was just money and jobs. And our second impact was that when people have money and jobs, or when people are not cut off from the outside world, they liberalize more. So they're more likely to become moderate because they have to work with other people. So you can't like hate other countries if you're buying some stuff from them. So this has the same problem in OG of do I preempt every other case or do I just talk about why it's a big deal? And both are difficult to do. So the strategy that we opted for is first explaining why independently our benefit of money is more important than other possible impacts. And the way we did this was what I would call like independent way. So this is not anything mind blowing. All sorts of debaters do this all the time. But the way you do this is that you find ways to explain something is important in relation to a large group of things, not just one specific thing. So the most common ones you'll hear is that money is good because people can decide what to do with it. And that means that it's used in the best possible way for utility. So you can say the benefit of money is that it gives you agency, or if you want to be like, if you want to sound human and not like fancy, you can say the benefit of money is you can do whatever you want with it. And so people will buy the things that they want. People will protect themselves in the way that they want. But on opposition, even if your sanctions make the government give you better regulations, or even if sanctions make the government give you more freedoms, not everyone might know how to use those freedoms. Not everyone will actually care about those freedoms as much. So like, for example, in a majority Muslim country, like Saudi Arabia, like women not being able to drive is symbolically something that is quite painful for women. And so you might say we might pressure Saudi Arabia into allowing them to drive. And there's lots of impacts of them being able to drive, obviously. But some women might benefit from driving, but every woman benefits from having more money because now they can use it for whatever they want. So this kind of weighing is basically like the type you should be practicing the most, because back half weighing is not hard. Because back half weighing, you know exactly what you're weighing against. Top half, you don't. So you want to have ways to prove that an impact is just universally really, really important. So that's the first suggestion in terms of weighing. The second suggestion, of course, is other than doing like independent weighing, you want to point out the extent of your case. So this is where I think it does get a bit complex. So the last thing I said wasn't mind-blowing. It's because it's not. This one I think actually is kind of new. So with predicts motions coming up and analysis becoming more important in predicts motions, because obviously it doesn't matter, whether you predict a good future or bad future. It just matters whether you correct. A lot of the analysis that you're throwing out can't just be reasons for something being true. Now we have to go into detail about how strong reasons are, why one reason is stronger than another reason. So weighing extent is what I always do at the top of my speech in deputy. So I'm like, why have we sufficiently proven an impact and how big of an impact is it? So one of the things that I would suggest in weighing extent is that there's a bunch of ways in which you can prove a mechanism is stronger than like just a thrown out line of reasoning. And you probably want to have this in the back of your mind in your case file. So when I'm deputy, I think I'm going to internally weigh, then I'm going to externally weigh. So externally is the thing that I suggested earlier. Internally, I'm going to say things like, these mechanisms are strong because they're resilient to different types of threats. So I might say, for example, this mechanism is dependent on the profit incentive of businesses, and this incentive is unlikely to go away because it's the lifeblood of how economics works. But their mechanism is dependent on things like whether the government cares about things like climate change anymore, and that can change over time as voter incentives change. So our mechanism is consistent; it won't go away. Their mechanism is inconsistent. Another thing I might do for extent is this loses you money on a very large scale. But the problem is that if you lose money, you have to borrow something to cover that loss. And then you have to pay back interest rates, which means that you have to pay even more in this particular program. And then you lose even more money. So it's a growing harm. It doesn't just stop here, it compounds on itself. So our mechanism might not be strong in the first instance. Maybe we don't prove that this immediate implementation of whatever policy we're debating will like bankrupt you, but we prove that over time this is going to become a huge cash sink and you're going to lose lots of money. So those are my main suggestions for top half, which is you want to find, first of all, the core assumption behind the debate and prove it so that you can throw out impacts. And then second of all, you want to weigh both internally and externally. So internally, you want to show why your mechanisms are so strong. And externally, you want to show why your case matters independently and just above most other things, because it'll be difficult for you to weigh above specific things. So yeah, that's top half. Now I'm going to move on to back half, but before that, does anyone have any questions?
I think I get the idea, but do you think you could just share a couple more examples on internal, external weighing, please?
Yeah, sure. So internal and external weighing. So obviously these are always hard, but if you've looked through serious posting and you look up weighing, there's this really useful comment. So I actually, that was me actually when I was younger. I made a post and I said, hey, I'm struggling with weighing. I am bad at weighing. Help. So Miko Vituk, who is a really, really good debater, world's finalist twice now, I think, made a comment on that. And he gave a list of weighing metrics. And he gave a list of 5 internal weighing metrics, which you can use. So I'm just going to give you some examples from there. So one way that I do a lot of weighing is sometimes your extension is just describing all sorts of different people who are involved in a activity. So in Taptastic Finals, Jess and I were CG, and the motion was about a market that would be created about selling your experiences. And most of our extension was what you would call characterization, right? Like we were just explaining who will be the sellers, who will be the buyers, how will it affect them, why the market will be big, etc., etc., etc. And a lot of our weighing, other than the impacts we were giving, was internal. We were trying to win on internal mechanisms as opposed to just like the impact of our case. So the weighing there is, for example, characterization, which is that our weighing talks about the psychological behaviors of agents within this field. So op might say that people who are selling experiences want to do XYZ because this makes them money. And gov might say they want to do ABC because it makes them money. You can't break that deadlock because these are all reasons that a rational actor might take. So when we add characterization of who these people are, we show you what their priorities are and we show you how they think. So it becomes more likely that our case is true because we've told you who the actors are and what their incentives are. So that's for characterization. Another one could be realism. So I remember once we were debating a motion about Japan's constitution and the fact that it has an article in it. It's a very infamous debate actually, which is that the Japanese were after I think it was after World War II, they were forced to accept an article in the constitution which said that they will not have like an army, and so most of their forces in the army are just called the special police forces. So the motion is about abolishing that article so that Japan doesn't have anything in their constitution saying they can't have an army. And I was CG saying we should abolish it. And my OG's argument was that the Japanese army is very weak, and without abolishing this, there's no way to fund it. And one of my weighing metrics was that opening government is unrealistic because it's not true that the Japanese army is very weak. And anyone who reads the news, anyone with basic world knowledge knows that the Japanese army wasn't as weak as they were claiming it was. Like I'm not saying like they're like the world's strongest army, but their claim was like they can't even protect themselves against like pirates, which was very exaggerated. So my claim was that the case from OG is unrealistic because empirically we know that this is not something that aligns with our view of other events that we know. But our case is realistic because we're going to assume the army is strong. Um, and there's lots of other ways to weigh things, like charitability is also internal weighing if you think about it, because what you're doing is you're weighing your interactions in terms of their strength of analysis. So a charitable response is just more strong in persuading you that something is true, while an uncharitable response is not. So that's also internal weighing. So one thing that I'll often do is say, opposition. So in parenting motions, this happens a lot. So I'll be like, opening government assumes that parents will be evil on our side and good on their side. And we assume that parents will be good on both sides. So we are assuming a more fair playing field and we're addressing the debate more fairly. So we're more charitable. That's another way to weigh internally. So, you're weighing engagement in that instance, but I would call it a part of internal weighing. So do those examples sort of help that out, Daniel?
Yes, they did for sure. Thank you. Also, I don't know if this may be asking too much, but if you have a link to that question or a screenshot, I think everyone here would really appreciate it. Thank
Yeah,
you.
sure. So it's I'm very happy to send the post over after the round, like after this. In fact, you know what? I will send it to Prosper Michael, who was the very nice person who invited me here. Um, and I will ask him to share it on like whatever group chat you guys are on. So let me just find it because I can't use the Zoom from my phone right now, so it'll be a bit of a difficulty. Okay, I'll also read the questions in chat. So the first question is, how do you go about preempting the closing case of the other side, especially if the top half team probably did little in the debate? Um, do you mean like you are, so Kelvin, do you mean like your CG and, oh no, sorry, no. Are you saying you're OG and O is bad? So you're trying to preempt what CO is going to run? Could you just
Yes.
clarify that, Kelvin? Yeah, okay. Yeah, no, that's always an L. It's always difficult to sort of predict what is going to happen. Pretty much in any context, it's basically impossible to predict. So the first thing I do when I preempt closing cases is that as long as the obvious, big, genuinely just like blatantly clear arguments are dealt with, I feel a lot less stressed because back half teams will always be creative, they'll always be smart, they'll come up with ways to weigh things. But to some extent, you have to trust the judge on what matters. So the first thing I would suggest is to not worry too much about very out of the world cases. The reason that they're out of the world, of course, is because they're either hard to prove or hard to weigh, right? And if the team in your back half is just that good that they can just prove anything, then at that point, they're just magic. Like it doesn't really matter what you're doing. But realistically, they're going to be struggling. Thank you, Prosper. So the first suggestion is don't worry too much about if your OO is weak, what your CO might run. Just assume that your CO runs the correct OO and weigh against that. The second suggestion is that the main way to extend is to either change the grounds of the debate, which means that we're debating top half on who gets more money, and then back half goes like, that's not even the real debate here. The real debate is political stability. Or you're making an extension based on analysis, right? There's only two ways to extend, right? The only two ways are you say that there's something else as an impact that matters more, or you say there's a mechanism in top half that makes it a completely different debate. And the thing about preempting is that it's very difficult to preempt back half unless you know the motion very well. So if you don't, instead of preempting the cases, you can just preempt the approaches. So the approach is either that your impact is less important than something new, or that your mechanisms are insufficient. So for mechanisms, the easy one is to always, and I always do this in deputy, to point out why you've sufficiently proven your case and why any new responses that come up will only mitigate it. So you've hit all your burdens, etc. And of course, the internal weighing I mentioned. So if I've shown you why my case is so likely, so true, why I've hit all the burdens, then an analytical extension is very, very difficult. So that cancels out a lot of COs like rebuttal extensions. But for impact, instead of trying to preempt a new approach, if you do the weighing that I was suggesting, like the independent weighing against lots of different things, then you can preempt lots of different cases anyway. So for example, if I'm proving that money is so important, CO might come up with a stability extension. They might also come up with a feminist extension about minorities. And they might also come up with an extension about art or something, right? All of these impacts still have to deal with my weighing about how only money can give you access to tangible things, or only money can give you access to the prerequisite to life. So normally if I can't predict back half, I don't think too hard about it and stress myself out. I try to attack the approaches instead of the cases because I can't predict the cases, but I know for a fact that the only way they can enter the debate is two approaches. So I'm locking out the roads as opposed to the cars themselves. Does that help explain anything, Kelvin, or do you want to ask anything more about that?
I think that's great.
Okay, cool. How do you generate matter and effectively weigh in motions that you're unfamiliar with, especially if you're in top half? This is a good question. So I think the main answer to this is the same thing I said earlier about identifying the trade-off. So if it's unclear to you what happens, then you kind of just have to spend a bit more time visualizing the motion and seeing what the difference is. And then that'll solve your problem. Because once you know what's happening, you're no longer unfamiliar with it, right? Like even if it's a new topic, at least you know what happens to people and so you can debate it. But if you're unfamiliar because you don't understand what changes at all, so this happens to be in a lot of narrative motions, right? Like there's a narrative that I feel like is very not really real. Like no one really believes this narrative, but for some reason we have to act like it. In those instances, you got to understand that like everyone else is in the same situation as you, and they also have no clue what the change is. So often what I'll do is that if I don't know what the motion is about at all, then I will spend a long time, even if it takes me like 5 or 6 minutes of prep, I'm willing to sacrifice that to understand what the steps of the motion are so that I know clearly what the hell is going on, until I understand what the trade-off is. So unfortunately, if you're unfamiliar with the motion, I mean, of course you're at a disadvantage. You should always be putting time into understanding what the trade-off is. But the second thing is, and this is another suggestion I got from Hadar actually, is to realize that if you're unfamiliar, everyone else is unfamiliar. So often, the team that wins is the one that gets their shit together the fastest. So instead of trying to do like the best possible case, you're just trying to quickly figure out how to run a reasonable, solid reasoning on your side. You're not trying to like do anything too complex. You're just like, this motion makes no fucking sense. Everyone is confused. I'm going to find a way to run a simple, understandable case faster than other people. I'm going to build it like in a very solid way. And by the end of the round, everyone will be running weird stuff that no one will understand. My case will be simple and understandable. So this is particularly true of like hypothetical technology motions, um, complex motions about like how we prefer a world where humans behave differently. Because there's so many things that change that you can never predict what's going to happen. So you just pick the most simple, certain thing you can, and you just make it an airtight argument, and you just pray. Um, and the reason obviously is because if you're really that uncomfortable with emotion, then you're already at a disadvantage. You can't be expecting to do like a 99 speech on emotion that you don't know anything about. But this normally keeps you alive and in the sport. So if you're unfamiliar and you run like a solid case almost all the time, you'll be in the winning half. You'll take a 2 or a 1. And of course, that's what you're aiming for, right? Like you want to be a speaker that can constantly be in the winning half, because you can always take 2s to the finals in most tournaments. Like if you just take seconds, you break most tournaments, and then if you keep taking seconds, you get to finals. And then after that, like that's a completely different ball game. So does that sort of help explain the answer, Joyce, or do you want to ask anything else?
Yeah, that's fine. I guess that's fine.
Okay, no problem. So now we're gonna go on to back half. So back half is my favorite. Obviously, I'm gonna have a lot more comfort in this area. Now, I don't do back half particularly in any special way, but I think that there's a lot of ways to make back half easier when you're entering the sport that will just make your life in general simpler. So my first suggestion for back half is that I know that this is controversial, but this is just my suggestion. I know that it is generally better to run more things in most people's minds because they think that if they mess up one thing, then the other two will still stand or whatever. I personally think that one complete argument is more stable than two 70% completed arguments. And the reason for that is because if you have a good round and I see two partially completed arguments, I will immediately identify the missing links and it'll only take me 20 to 30 seconds to take it out. So if you have good teams in your round, people will surgically dismantle your case if you're running two different things and you haven't like covered all your bases. And the obvious reason for this is that top half is listening really carefully and they're going to be asking POIs to make sure you sound stupid. And of course, back half is going to have a whip, right? And the only job of the whip is to make sure that your case is gone. So it's often, in my opinion, my first suggestion is it's often a generally good idea to settle on one argument. That doesn't mean that the one argument needs to be very narrow. You can have like problem solution impacting and a bunch of different rebuttal integrated into that one argument. So it's not like the argument is very narrow and only has one idea in it. But the core push, I think, should always be simple and short. And I'll give my reasoning for this. The main reasoning is that judges don't remember. So like I think that in a 56-minute format where you have so many speeches, the judge just will not remember details when they end the round. And the thing is that deliberation is good and all, but you are not trying to win in the deliberation. You're trying to win before the deliberation. You want the judge going into the deliberation thinking you've won. And then after that, you want them to ignore you and just be like, oh, who takes the second, the third, the fourth? You want your team to be clearly winning. So for that, you can't make your case and your path to victory so complex that the judge doesn't understand it unless they look at their notes and they go over it. You want it to be like crystal clear why you're winning. And for that, it's generally better to go for shorter, more concise arguments. So for example, if there's a motion about criminal justice and top half debates about who causes less recidivism or who causes less abuse to criminals, then a lot of times in back half, you can run an extension on who is going to stop future crimes, right? Like deterrence. But you can also run a case on trust. I would strongly suggest picking one, because even if you have two incredibly good extensions left, it's not worth it to risk it. It is almost always better to pick one. So I would generally run a case on that one thing, and then I would just be like, everything in top half falls to this argument for these reasons, blah 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 blah, and then try to position it very heavily. And I think that that's the first suggestion for back half, which is that especially in instances where you're not very, very good at the motion type, like if you're extremely good at the motion type, you know you can run everything in 7 minutes, like fine. If you're really that confident, go for it. I've never been that confident about any motion type, but if you are, then go for it. But in general, it is better to go for one case. So my second suggestion for back half is, and this one is also nothing groundbreaking. A lot of people already do this. But there's a bunch of different ways you can come up with horizontal extensions and a bunch of different ways for analytical extensions. So I'm just going to give tips on both of those. So a horizontal extension is a different impact. So it's like top half is debating about something, and you come in and say, the topic addresses something more important. So like top half is debating about climate change, and you go like, actually, the real question is political stability. So horizontal extension is moving the debate to a completely different grounds. You also hear people calling different ways to get to the same impact horizontal extensions. I mean, obviously, this is not a sport, that's a science. Like some people will call a completely new mechanism that is a completely different world of arguments, like a horizontal extension. But you know, I personally would just call that analytical, but that's fine. For the sake of what I'm going to be saying, horizontal means new impact, analytical means new proof. So in terms of a horizontal extension, the first suggestion is often to zero in on stakeholders or zoom out. So one immediate heuristic is when you are debating, for example, the LGBT movement. This is a good example from like a partner called Gwen Stearns who taught me this. Sometimes you'll be debating like a large swath of the movement, right? Like you're talking about pretty much the entire movement, just gay people, lesbian people, bi people, trans people, whatever. And sometimes you can zoom in on one part of that movement as the most important. So, for example, a very common version of this you'll hear is just religious people. So you can say religious people are often more likely to have a difficult time expressing their identity. And so we're just going to focus on religious people. Another way to narrow in is to say this, like a motion about drag, for example, right? Like drag might affect trans people the most because drag is about like people showing, like expressing different genders and what they've been assigned or whatever. So you could focus and zoom in on trans people. And this is very common. So a lot of times in your rounds, you'll hear people say, we're going to talk about the most vulnerable minority, blah, 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 blah. And then they narrow the debate into like just a small minority. So this is a way to do a back half extension that people already know. The one that I want to focus on is zooming out. So people don't do this as often because they struggle with the weighing. But it is fully legitimate, I think, to make an argument about more people, even if you're willing to give up vulnerability. So the example I'm going to give here is that there's a motion about drag queens and whether the commercialization of drag is good. And the debate is whether you regret it. So my friend was CG, and her top half made a really good claim on why drag's commercialization harms drag queens and trans people. The back half case from my partner was that it doesn't just harm trans people, it's that if drag becomes commercialized, it creates immense fear and backlash against all people in the LGBTQ community. So she was focusing on a less vulnerable minority, but she still said, even if it is the case that the minority is better off, even if a few like very discriminated against trans people are better off, everyone in the gay movement faces some level of harassment. And even if it's not as intense, it's something that we should care about because there's just so much of it and so many people are affected by it. This is the type of extension that people aren't used to, which is why you'll have a huge advantage on it because most people don't know how to way why minorities might not be the most important way to make a decision. But zooming out is one method I'm going to suggest first of all. And the tips for why you should weigh minorities is that it's often very hard to help someone who's in a very vulnerable situation. So like if someone is really poor, maybe like their partner is abusive, they can't pay bills, they live in like a super crime-ridden neighborhood, and then you're debating like an art motion, and you're like, oh, now they'll get catharsis, right? Teams will be like, oh, now these poor sad people will be able to feel happy because they watched a TV show. But like, it's really easy to just be like, no, like it doesn't work that way. It's not like the more sad you are, the bigger of a deal any benefit to you is. You can also just not enjoy something because you're sad. Oh, sorry. Oh yeah, sorry about that. So there's lots of ways to weigh why minorities matter less. And oh, that sounds wrong. There's a lot of ways to weigh majorities over minorities in debates. Um, the second suggestion for back half in terms of like horizontal extensions is when you try to change the grounds of debate, I would suggest approaching back half from a weighing perspective first. So obviously this is not like true for everyone. For me personally, I find it easier to prove things than I do to weigh things. But even the people I know who are very good at weighing tend to approach things from a weighing perspective. And it really helped me to approach things from a weighing perspective. So what do I mean by that? So when you're approaching an extension, you know that top half is proved, let's say in a political motion. And it's not an active motion, it's just like a type of politics, like, I don't know, anger and politics. Top half might have proven, like, I don't know, good policies get passed, which in debate normally just means left wing policies. So maybe top half is debating who will get more money to the poor or something. A good way to approach this is what matters more than giving money to the poor. And in the politics motion, you'll often have a list of things that you know are commonly assessed. So for me, for example, I think about turnout. I'd say that even if you get a little bit more welfare, it's more important to have more people voting because the impact of voting is just so large. Like it makes you more transparent. It makes a system forced to like address their concerns, not just a few poor people, but everyone, etc. So turnout could be one. Another one could be violence. You could just be like, it just is less important if you get like a bit more money. If the people on the ground are like constantly at each other's throats in a way that they literally can't live safe lives. So like in countries like India, you'll see riots are shockingly common. The same is true in a lot of other nations with like low security. So in those instances, you want to approach from the perspective of what are the ways in which I can make myself look like a big deal? And then you can cut down to the things you can actually prove. So my main suggestion for horizontal extensions is when you're approaching what you want to run, think of whether it's winning first, and then come up with a bunch of arguments, and then pick the ones that you think are easy to prove. So in prep time, what that looks like is you come up with 3 arguments that you think are winning. You rank them on which one is the easiest to prove or easiest to win on, like in a holistic sense. And then you keep them there, and then you cut them off as top half runs them, or as you feel like it won't be relevant. And then you pick one of those arguments and you give it to your partner and you throw it in. So that's on horizontal extensions. In terms of analytical extensions, so this is the part which I actually enjoy because I think this is the part where at least my interest in back half has sort of really peaked, is if you want to have a way to extend on top half analytically, normally it's impossible to figure out what you're going to say in prep because you don't know what they're going to miss. And that makes analytical extensions hard. And the difficult part of this is that sometimes there are motions where there is only one big clash. So this house predicts motions are a perfect example of this, right? Like no matter what you do, there's only one clash. There can't be any other clashes. So in those instances, it's like, how do I prep? So the way that I would suggest prepping when you feel like there's only one big clash is that you become exceptionally intense and intricate about what the logical interactions of the whole round are going to be. So what I do is I write down exactly all the steps that I think are important for the argument to occur. So in a social movement motion, the first step is who creates the message. Second step is how is the message distributed? Third step is how is the message interpreted? Fourth step is who interprets and supports with the message. The fifth step is why does that support lead to policy? The sixth step is why does that policy get implemented properly? The seventh step is why does that implementation outweigh any benefits on opposition? And then you start weighing and like doing all the interactions. These are very small, tiny things that people don't normally want to prove because they're really not things you have to prove, right? Like in some senses, we don't have to go through all of these minutiae in motions like this. But when you're in a situation where you have very little to run in back half, to prep with the burdens is crucial. So an example of this is that there was a motion about an elephant who's a painter. Yeah, it was zoo IV, so the motions weren't very serious. And the motion was that the elephant is is seeing dreams of her comrades coming in and telling her to free them from the wild. So the debate was, should you become exclusively a painter of like animal rights or not? And what we did was we wrote down the burdens, right? The first burden is, why will painting animal rights make you happy? The second one is, why can you not get this happiness from any other type of painting? And the third one is, why does this happiness matter more than any money you might make from other paintings, etc., etc. But then we added a fourth burden, which is, why does it need to be exclusive? And the thing is that that is what op pushed on top half, which is that op pushed this extremely aggressive line of, you might care a lot about animal rights, but why do you want to stop yourself from any other form of art? Because you might just want to sit at home and like make a few paintings that you publish about like, I don't know, Doreen or something. And top half kind of had like this OG that was trying to squirrel out of actually having to debate that, where they were like, no, no, animal rights can encompass lots of things, blah, blah, blah. So in back half, we said the burden top half is missing is why does it have to be only animal rights? And then we said that our entire case is when you draw things that are not about animal rights, you end up feeling huge emotional pain and you end up in a situation of stress and discomfort. Now I was zoo IV, so it wasn't exactly the best extension in the world, but it was uh, it was like an example of missing burdens. Another perfect example of this, there's a motion which is that there's a technology. If you use it, then you enter a virtual world and you can do whatever you want. You can create anything in it. And top half, we knew the side that was saying, we wouldn't allow it, we would ban it. We knew they would say that when you get into this world, everything is created by you, so you're gonna feel bad, because you're never gonna find any meaning in something if you know that it comes from you. So we had an analytical extension where we knew that they missed a few burdens. The first burden they missed was, if it's so sad to live in this world, why do people keep entering it? And we explained why it's impossible for you to know what these people are going through. Even if you know them, why you still go in, why you believe it, what kind of people will go in, etc., etc. Another analytical burden they missed was not just about how you feel bad, but they forgot to explain why, on the counterfactual, in the world where you would be maybe poor and you're desperately trying to get into this technology, why would your world be better? And again, OO tried to run a very uncharitable version of the case where they were like, a lot of poor people will not go into this technology because they can't afford it. This is about middle class people. And then they went like, a middle class life is better than being stuck in technology, which we were just like, this is not the debate. Like, it might be the case that lots of desperate people go in. Okay. So basically, finding those burdens and then using them to extend is the first step. And the second step is when you write those burdens down, you need to know how to weigh those burdens. So, for example, one of the cheapest ways of weighing I've ever heard in my life is that this is logically prior, which is like, okay, it might be, but it might also not be like relevant. So, for example, if there's a motion which is like, oh, we should work with China instead of working with the US. Like logically prior to whether China is good is the question of, will China work with you? But if the motion is like, you're India, okay, no, India is a bad example, sorry. If the motion is like you're an ASEAN nation, then it's a bit dumb to be like, China will just be like, oh, you want to work with us and give up parts of the ocean? No, we won't work with you. So, burdens are not weighed on the basis of like random arbitrary things like what comes first, right? The real importance of a burden is, what is the most contested part of the debate? Like, what is it that people are actually genuinely saying is not relevant or true? So in that elephant example, for example, the real question in the debate isn't whether she feels happy about animal rights. In fact, everyone agrees that she feels happy about painting animal rights. The real question is, should she give up everything else for it? And so we just said that this burden matters because it's the only one that is the unique harm from opposition or something. So what you want to do other than writing down the burdens as your second step is you write down why each burden is the most important one in the round. And obviously, you want to be able to weigh every burden above the other. So often you'll end up like having contradictory weighings there. Obviously, you're not going to use all of them because you're only going to make one or two burdens that you're going to fill. And then you are very, very ready for extending on top half. So what I often do is I'll also write down the strongest mechanisms I can think of for each of these burdens. And then the second that they miss that burden, immediately I'm done because I know what I need to do in my member speech, and I can spend all of my time on positioning my extension, on rebuttal, on framing, on impacting, all sorts of free stuff that I have time for now. So that's how I would suggest going for analytical extensions. I guess I've gone a bit over time. So for out rounds, I guess I won't have much time, but I can go through the generals of out rounds. But before that, does anyone have any questions about back half? You can send it in chat. You can just unmute. Anything is fine. Why is out rounds relevant to me? Okay, Brian. So for out rounds, why is it relevant to you? Because you might get there. In fact, statistically, a fourth of you will get there, right? Because like most tournaments break 25% of teams. So roughly a fourth of you should be in out rounds, like just mathematically. Um, but yeah, so okay. Anyway,
Yeah, hello.
was that a question? Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, can I be heard? Am I audible?
Yeah, go for it. Go for it. I can
Uh-huh.
hear you.
Yeah. So, what's the best way of like weighing against like teams when especially you feel like a particular burden is missed throughout the debate? Because sometimes you try your very best to weigh and it seems like new matter altogether. So, is there a very efficient way of weighing to make sure that, especially for member, you ensure that everyone gets to engage in that in any particular way?
Yeah, so okay, this is a good question. Selling your extension is important. I mean, there's a pretty helpful workshop called Selling Your Extension, which I think is from Techway. It's a pretty good one. You can watch that if you want to go for details on it. But my general suggestion is if your extension is about a gap in their case, then what I always do is I say, imagine OG is correct about everything, but this gap is still missing. Just how persuasive is it to you? And if it just sounds like it's unpersuasive, then you already are kind of convincing the judge. You're like, they missed the actual question in the debate. So, for example, even if OG is correct and Ellie loves painting animal rights, why is it that, sorry, are you really persuaded that she should quit everything and give up all the things that opposition is talking about? Do you really think that proving that Ellie likes animal rights is enough to prove that she should give up everything else? And then I would say, of course not, because without this burden, the case only has harms. It doesn't have benefits. So one way to weigh when you're doing analytical extensions is to point out how absurd it would be to believe a certain case without a burden proven. So another example is obviously the most common example in the world, which is like, oh, top half talks about how parents should say this to their kids. So you can be like, even if they proved that this would be really great if the kids followed, do you really think that this case is relevant if the kids don't listen to you at all? Like, is this persuasive to you? And obviously, you don't say it in those exact words, but you're trying to say it through like debate words, which is like, even though OG proves that children will listen to you, without this burden, their case doesn't have A, B, C, D, or whatever. So you're trying to point out the implications of the burden. If you're giving a completely new argument, then the way you weigh against your top half is the way you weigh against everyone, which is you just say, my impact is absolutely huge and it is just impossible to compare top half with me. So like, even though they prove like some people change their minds, I prove that there's millions of dollars going to charity. It just does not compare because first of all, and then you give your weighing metrics, right? Like on scale, we help more people. On intensity, people feeling better is nothing compared to people having food, blah, 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 blah. So your positioning for analytical extensions is to show how dumb the case would be without your case. And your positioning for like impact extensions, or like not impact extensions, sorry, horizontal extensions, is to just say just how unimportant they sound compared to you. Does that help explain anything, Matthew?
Yeah, so yeah, thank you.
Okay, and then I got a question in chat. Is there a way you can use engagements, or in other words, convince the judge that your responses are a reason you win over your opening? Okay, good question. Rebuttals are content, and rebuttals should be credited by judges. The reason judges don't credit rebuttals in back half is because it's hard, not because they don't know that they should be credited, but because they're just lazy. So the thing about rebuttals is that often they don't have clear conclusions when they're thrown out in debates, so it's unclear why they matter. And that's the only way you can make your responses consistently way over top half. So you do to some extent for things like rebuttals and weighing rebuttals in back half, or for example, for things like when you're weighing. I haven't gotten into that, but like sometimes your extension is just weighing. You kind of do have to get very meta. And in responses, you kind of have to do that as well. You can be like, I'm going to beat this claim, and the conclusion of this rebuttal will be this. And this conclusion is more important than anything top half has proven. So, for example, if there's a motion about nationalizing an industry, and OG proves that they distribute money better because they give it to the poor, and OO proves that they make more money over time because the private sector will grow, right? If I come in from CO and then I say, I'm going to prove that you don't distribute money to the poor, but actually you create corruption at the top level, I'm going to say this. I'm going to say, my rebuttal will take out opening government's impact of distributing money to the poor and instead increase corruption. The conclusion of this rebuttal is that their comparative harm is no longer relevant in the round. And hence, I give you a stronger response than opening opposition because I take out their case completely. Obviously, this is a bit vague. It's not perfect. Like you would have to workshop it in prep. But the point is, you want to be explicit about the conclusion of your rebuttal instead of just throwing it out. So the biggest problem that people have in my experience as a judge is that they'll give a rebuttal, but I'll have no clue what happens at the end of it. So for example, they'll be like, oh, this movement might convince people because they care about this one thing, but people also care about this other thing, which is just a bad rebuttal because I have absolutely no clue what to do with it. I'm just like, yes, they might. So like I have zero idea how to place it in the debate. So what you want to do is you always want to have flag posting of the conclusion of your rebuttal. And you'll notice this in all sorts of top rooms where they'll be like, this rebuttal completely flips their claim, or this rebuttal takes out this part of their impact. Not all speakers do this because rebuttal is not as, unfortunately, I think rebuttal's almost gone out of style. I don't think many speakers do rebuttal that much nowadays, which is a bit of a shame. But if you do see rebuttal speakers who do it very well, you'll notice that they always end their rebuttals with conclusions. They complete their rebuttals. So treating rebuttals less like random lines of analysis and treating them more like a full holistic claim that you have to finish is the best way to make it so that the judge has to credit it. The other way is just to frame your rebuttal as an extension. So you can just be like, my extension is why you'll end up having lots of corruption in the nationalist industry, which is like, it's a faster way to do it. And it works with like most judges because they can't tell the difference between rebuttal and extensions anyway. Does that help explain the answer, Joyce? Or do you want to know anything else? Okay, awesome. So I should probably ask Prosper. Prosper, should I continue with out rounds, or do you think that since it's been like roughly an hour, I should just stop?
Hello. So you can wrap up in like 15 minutes so that we end it here.
Okay, like 15 minutes. Yeah, I'll just do it quickly then. So for out rounds, all of the advice I'm going to give you for out rounds is extremely common. Like you will find it everywhere, but I'm just giving it in case you haven't seen those videos or heard other people say it. So like this is nothing new from me. This is all just like common stuff. First suggestion for out rounds is people will tell you you're trying to take a strategic second or first. But it's a bit difficult to understand how to do that. The first suggestion is you're not trying to prove like nuclear war in an out round. You're trying to prove a solid, simple case. So in out rounds, stay calm and try to stay solid as opposed to trying to win the case or like win the room. So when people say be happy taking the second, that doesn't mean you don't engage with other teams that are taking the first, although it might, if you think that's strategically better that way. but it means that your case needs to be solid. So what will happen in out rounds is the judges will not be taking into account every single clash. They'll be going into prep immediately. They have in their head teams that they think might be going through and might not be going through. And what you want is for your team to be the team that's obviously and very clearly going through no matter what happens. And you don't want to be in the discussion at all. You want it to be clear you're going through. And for that, the simplest way to do it is to keep your case exceptionally simple and basic. So you don't want your case to be one that needs to be pushed by judges into deliberation. So in top rooms, often it's not actually always the best strategy to go for like a simple basic case, because that might give you a 2 or maybe a 3. But it will very rarely give you a 1, because you have to do a lot of work and complex responses and like weighing to make your case actually win. But in out rounds, often everyone is like getting nerves, everyone is getting freaked out, and they're running all sorts of crazy stuff. And they are like, oh, OG ran everything. I'm so scared I'm going to run something crazy. You want to avoid that. You always want to stick with something simple and basic that has like a clear impact and you're weighing it. That's not to say that you can't and you shouldn't run creative cases in out rounds, which is actually what leads to me is my second thing, which is that in out rounds, it's almost always better for you to run something that is more clear, even if it gives up a big part of like your actual strength in the case. So like what I'm saying is, even if you have a really good analytical extension, if you find it difficult to position the extension, if you think it's not clear why that extension is winning, even if logically, if you look through your notes, it's obvious your extension is going to be winning, it's almost always better to give up that extension. So like if I'm back half, I will prefer to run something different or new, or for example, an extension that like an analytical extension, like a mechanism that's just so clearly different, then I will over something that might necessarily be better. So clarity is the second thing, both in your speeches and your case choice. So the first thing is trying to run simple things, not going too complex. And the second one is the way that you give speeches. Because in most out rounds, they're going to try to balance the panel. So there's people from all over the region if you're in like a major. And there'll be like WGM balance, there'll be ESL balance, and not everyone will be comfortable with the same style or the same level of complexity. So you're trying to go for the lowest common denominator. So you want your case to be extremely simple to the point where like a kindergartner could understand it, because you have absolutely no clue how comfortable that the judges are with the topic. So a good analogy for this is whenever I have an economics out round, I will often skip a lot of detailed complex analysis and I will go for something that is understandable. So this is quite funny because I keep dropping in econ out rounds. But you know, if you're actually a good debater, you'll see that people who advance as well, they'll run simple things. So in World's Quarters, where David destroyed me, the case that he ran was this will just it was about the IMF and conditionality, and he just said that if we keep conditions on countries, then we will get money back. And his case was exceptionally simple. It was just when you get money back to the IMF, that is more money to give to other people in loans. It's more likely to get investment, and in general, you're going to get more support for these countries. And so he sidesteps the debate on whether the conditions are good or bad, and he goes completely into a very simple claim, which is if someone who lends money doesn't get it back, then they won't invest again. And that's not complicated. It's not economic jargon. It's not like about the money multiplier effect or exchange rates being speculated on leading to devaluation, which was what OO and OG talked about. It's very simple. It's just if you lend money and then you get it back, you can lend more money. And it's not complicated to understand. So often in out rounds, you should not only be solid, but you should be exceptionally clear and simple. And the third thing about out rounds is that it is more important, I think, in out rounds to keep your mental than it is in rounds. So going into an out round, you're going to be scared, you're going to be worried, and you're going to be thinking about whether you'll advance or not. And the thing about out rounds for me, at least, is this is like again like a very generic tip, but I think it's been helpful for me, is that you go in with the mindset that you can go through. That's the first tip, which is don't freak yourself out, think that you're going to drop. But more importantly, you go in calm. So, sometimes I will sit there and just drink water and like play a video game or something before out rounds because that calms me down. Or for example, I will make peace with my performance. So, for example, I remember in Princeton semis, I was very happy that we got to semis, and I was very happy I got there with my friend. So I remember I was just like, um, I see the motion, and I thought it was a very fun motion. And my immediate conclusion was, I'm going to run something that I enjoy. It's going to be clear, and it's going to have a good shot of going through because I can do this. But I'm fine with dropping. I'm fine with advancing because I'm in a happy place. So mental is really, really important in out rounds. Like it is important, of course, through in rounds as well. But you can't be psyching yourself out. The most common way that people lose out rounds is assuming that they have started a new dangerous minefield where they're going to be knocked out and they're very scared. The best way to stay in it is to just be in your element in out rounds. So you don't want to enter quarterfinals feeling like, how did I get here? You want to enter quarterfinals feeling, okay, I'm going to be solid. This is just another debate. Um, so the first suggestion is to run simple cases. The second suggestion is to focus on clarity over anything else. And the third suggestion is to keep your mental as stable as possible, knowing that you can advance. You're not in a difficult situation. It's not like you're in a room where you'll never advance. And also knowing that your life won't end even if you don't. So like just keeping yourself calm in that mental space. And that first part of knowing that you can advance is very important because psyching yourself out, thinking like, wow, these are such good teams, is the best way to drop an out round. And if you want like structural reason as to why this is useful, then you can also realize that like if you think about it, then logically anyone who got good would have had to go into a room where they had zero chance of advancing, and then they did. So you're never gonna be in an out round where it's gonna be like, oh, I can advance very easily. The teams are not as good as me. And then you get better as a speaker, right? Like the only way you can get better is by beating teams that are better than you. So it's good to keep in mind that it is very normal for very, very good teams to just drop out rounds. And especially if you're in like a good uni for debate, where there's like a very competitive debate society that's already been successful, that kind of gets hammered into your head. So like when I was in LSE, I would consistently spar with like what at that time was the world's best speaker, and I would lose like 80% of the time, but 20% of the time I would actually win. And I would beat people who I thought I would never beat in my life. And that's what would tell me in out rounds that it's not impossible to beat these people, like they can lose. And that confidence, if you don't have it in out rounds, you're just screwed. Like you don't want to go in thinking I'm the guy who's gonna get dropped because everyone else is thinking that. Everyone else will be like, you're the bad team, you're gonna get eliminated. You want to go in thinking, no, I'm a contender. I have a good shot of going through. All of you should be scared, and I'm gonna be fine even if I don't, because I'm a mature human being. Which sounds simple, but it's a lot harder than it sounds. Okay, so do you guys have any general questions then before I run for dinner? So feel free to send them over in chat, unmute anything.
Yeah, I have a question.
Yeah, go for it.
What's it like being Princeton Ivy champion?
It's a shame that that is as of now. So I was very sad because Cato didn't get to finals. So for me, it's a bittersweet memory because I did the whole tournament hoping to hit Matt, and then I just didn't. I was like, bro, did you really have to get knocked out in semifinals? Like really? But I guess he did. He got destroyed by the other two teams that I forgot. I think Ilya destroyed him, which is very funny. Um, because Matt, most EPL motherfucker alive, speaks at 50 words per second, gets destroyed by the most simple strategic ESL dude in the world. So that was pretty funny. Um, does anyone have any questions that aren't designed to troll me?
Hi, Shaurya. So my thing is on recency bias, right? So especially if the better, more obvious teams that everyone expects to go through are in the closing half, and you are the guy with the least cred, and you are OG, how do you beat recency bias in the out rounds?
Oh, that is so hard. No, that is horrible. That is such a difficult position to be in sometimes. I get what you mean. It's like people are almost like the judges are almost like thinking like the real debate will start in back half. And like, I go for the philosophy of every judge is correct, and you should always trust your judge to be fair. But in a realistic sense, as someone who's judged myself, I know that often you will have people who will just be like, I'm not really expecting top half to go through, and they're sort of like expecting you to run bad stuff and then expecting the real debate to start in the back half. What I always do is I just pick. So I know for a fact that the team that I'm in is not expected to advance, and the judges don't expect me and my partner as a speaker to be advancing. So my general philosophy in debate as of now has been that I don't ever expect my speeches or my execution or my talent at anything in debate to get me through rounds. It's always like I'm a vehicle for the content. So in those situations, you want to make your case, like OG or O, whatever it is, the most obvious big impact in debate, which is like generally a good opening half strategy as well. But you just want to blow it up so well that the judge might not activate their automatic bias for you because you don't have rep, but they'll activate their automatic bias for the argument. So like a good example of this is I was in a room where, okay, this is not the best example because I wouldn't say that I was in a situation where the judges didn't think I'd advance because my partner was very, very good in that tournament. But it was a motion where we were expected to drop the back half, and it was about like whether we should have the same language in across the Balkans. And our case was just like if you start teaching the same language across like all the Balkans, then it'll cause like fear that your national identity is being ripped away from you. And then we were like talking about how there's been tensions in the area and all. And you know, we were worried that we were going to be wrong about the region because we had both read reasonable amounts, but not in like languages other than English. But what we did know is that one of the obvious clashes in the debate was that was the expected opposition argument, which is that there will be backlash. And so we pushed the case, and the selling point was just, look, you know, backlash is an actual concern in the real world. You know that when people get angry, it's a thing that affects people in their schools and so on. And you know this argument is not something you can ignore because it's going to be relevant throughout the round. You know we've proven it, and you know we've waited. So you have to keep us in the discussion. So in top half, it's all about your content, especially when you know that they're going to ignore you. So this is also like generally good practice for rounds where you know that people want you to drop. Is just like detach yourself from the case and just be like, look, I get it. I am like novice speaker or like I'm like mid-level speaker and I'm here with like incredibly good speakers. But like my case is good. You have to address my case. You can't just ignore it. And if you don't do that, and you go for something like a bit more creative, you try to go for something like smart because you know that the back half is going to be like very good, it'll end up being on you. So an argument that is unintuitive and like complicated, often people's biases will go towards the execution of that argument, and they'll be like, is the speaker doing this well enough? And if you really do have a bias against you, you don't want them thinking about you as a speaker. But a simple intuitive argument, you want them thinking about the case and nothing else. So when I'm in that situation, I mean, it's always like a bit tough. I just go like, my argument is going to be so obviously relevant that they can't throw it out. Does that help explain it? And this time I'm assuming it is Desmond on the Kojo one. Does that explain it, Desmond, or do you have any other questions? Okay, I'm gonna take the thumbs up from Prosper as a yes. So yeah, it looks like the chat is disabled, and if anyone wants to ask questions, they would have to unmute. But yeah, I guess that's it. You guys can contact me with questions if you want about the workshop, and I will send over a feedback form about my workshop because I do that normally. And you can fill it out with suggestions. It'll be completely anonymous, so you don't have to worry about me seeing what you're saying. So yeah. So is that it? I think that's it.
Yeah,
All right,
that's
then.
it.